Salutations, everybody. It is Matty here today. We're doing something a bit different. We haven't talked about Starfield in, I don't know, like a week. So I figured it's time to fire up the old Starfield engine, have a different type of conversation. So many of you know, when I talk about Bethesda Game Studios, since the ye old days, I've been called a bit of a fanboy. And I think I'd like to say I've leveled the playing field a little bit, but I wanted to do something that recently I collaborated with Luke Stevens on his own channel and kind of bring a different angle to the conversation like he did over there, where he brought me in to take a more positive look at things. And I wanted to bring in Luke today to have a more skeptical look at Starfield and its situation. So joining me today is Luke Stevens. Luke, how are you doing, my friend?
I'm doing very well. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm excited for this. And again, we just did this collaboration. I'll have it linked in the description down below. If you want to see the other half of our conversation, that'll be down below. But Luke, you made a video when Starfield was revealed, and I think you were very critical of it, but in a fair manner. And I wanted to invite you on to bring that perspective to light for a lot of people, because I understand the notion that when I talk about BGS, like, these are some of my favorite games of all time. So I typically have a more positive slant. I try to always keep it fair, but I know I look at things a bit more glass half full, because I have, like, so much love and legacy for their games. So for those who haven't seen the videos that you've done on Starfield, I just want to let people know what your general thoughts on Starfield as a whole are.
Sure. I mean, the word I always use is I try to be skeptical when I look at things. And all that really means, just so people know how I approach stuff, is that I don't get excited about things until I think there's reason to be excited for them. I don't get hyped for things because I got burned really bad with like Fallout 4 and games that I was hyped for, like Cyberpunk. So to avoid that now, I withhold judgment until I think there's evidence to support a positive stance, whether like positive meaning like an assertive stance, whether it's something that's optimistic or you're just cynical. I try to withhold judgment until there's evidence. And so far with Starfield, everything I've seen looks lackluster, I would say at best, and just bad at worst. And especially with Bethesda's recent track record, specifically BGS's track record,
Sure.
the last couple of outings haven't been too great. And the last one was like borderline criminal. So I just don't see much reason to be like super hyped about it.
Of course. No, and that's totally fair. So let's use that as a jumping off point, because for me, I very much approach Fallout 76 as like a heinous crime, but to me, it's become more of like a blip on the radar compared to their past work, where I'm like, okay, they were really good. They tried something new. It clearly didn't work out. They should never do it again. They're moving into Starfield, which is more along the lines of what they've done historically. It seems a bit more ambitious in my eyes, but I want to know, for you, looking at things, you said you felt burned with Fallout 4. Obviously, 76 speaks for itself. What was the first thing you saw that made you go like, okay, I'm not feeling what Bethesda's doing here?
Well, so I would say just at the outset, I mean, we've been talking about Starfield for years and years. I think it was like 10 years ago or something that they trademarked it for the first time.
Yeah.
It's been a long time coming. So I've always been like, okay, we'll keep an eye on that. We'll see what they can do. And if you asked me in 2017 what I would have thought of Starfield, I think my starting point would have been much higher, because the evidence of Bethesda's track record was relatively positive. Like, even though Fallout 4 wasn't for everybody, it's still a pretty good game. Though perhaps not the game some people were looking for, but still pretty good. So I would have been much more optimistic at that starting point. I would have maybe been at a 7 out of 10 instead of like 10 out of 10 hyped, but still like a 7 out of 10. But after Fallout 76 and after the showcase where they showed off, I think, kind of lackluster gunplay, graphics that just don't hold up in 2022 compared to the competition, performance issues, even in the recorded sections that they showed with frame hitching and staggering and things. I look at all of that and it builds a more negative case for me. So it weighs it down. So my starting point isn't like, I love Bethesda, let's see what they've got. Okay, it's not exactly what I was hoping for, but it's still pretty good. Instead, I'm starting much lower down on the ladder, and I'm looking for reasons to climb up higher, to be excited. But everything I continue to see, like from the game and from BGS, either isn't enough to pull me up, or is just like even enough to pull me back down. So that's where I'm at.
Got you. Was there a specific feature or mechanic that you were hoping was better? Because gunplay is something I agree with. Like, I thought the gunplay in Starfield, like, you can see my raw reaction. I was a steady crescendo upwards, but when I saw that gunplay, I got a little worry in my chest of,
Mhm.
okay, this should not for a 2022. I don't care what genre you're in predominantly. Like, this is mostly an RPG. You still have first person gunplay, and for all Cyberpunk, for example, got wrong, I thought the first person shooting there was good. And you look at Starfield and its shooting, I was like, this looks off. So was that something you saw that immediately kind of brought you down your proverbial ladder?
Yeah, and I think it builds a cumulative case, right? Like if anybody that you listen to or talk to is like, "Oh, Red Dead Redemption 2 sucks because of this one thing I don't like that's dumb. It's just dumb. There's got to be multiple variables that you consider. And so Starfield's gunplay is just one more, piece to the puzzle that doesn't bode super well. And when I saw that, just like you, I think I was like, oh, okay. I mean, maybe it's better than it looks, but in a showcase that they've been working on, and I mean, like we said, this game has been in the works for a decade. So they've had like a decade to think of how they share this game with the world. And the pieces that they show off leave most people like, I mean, maybe it's like, yeah, it's not great, but it has 200,000 lines of dialogue. I mean, maybe it's not great, but it's a big RPG and the world's going to be interesting. Those are just diversions and deflections. You got to call it like you see it. And so I'd say gunplay is a problem. All of these things just build a cumulative case that it makes it hard to defend, at least in my humble opinion.
No, of course. I think it should be respected because you're not sitting here just hating on it. You're looking at things you see and just calling them how you see it. To me, one of the things I've seen from some people is that to a level, Starfield has failed to differentiate itself mechanically from past BGS games, right? You see the settlement mode, the shooting's kind of shoddy like Fallout. Was this something that you felt personally? Because it reminds me, this may seem like a off the beaten path example, but it'll circle back to our topic. It reminds me of how I felt with Immortals Phoenix Rising, where I saw a lot of people losing their mind over that game and people calling it like finally a breath of fresh air from Ubisoft. But for me, I felt it was so mechanically similar to Assassin's Creed and Watch Dogs and Far Cry in its open world template that I felt it, despite its art style, failed to separate itself from the rest of the pack. So I just want to know for you if you fall into that camp a little bit as well before we progress forward, where you feel like Starfield maybe hasn't separated itself enough from the bunch, not just quality wise, like you've spoken to, but also feature wise.
From what they've shown, yeah, I agree. I don't think they've differentiated themselves. From what they've said, it sounds like there's stuff this game does that differentiates it, with 1,000 planets, with huge like a solar system to explore, multiple solar systems. That type of thing does separate it and differentiate it, but we haven't really seen that, which is another point where I go, okay, well, they had a big reveal keynote where they could have shown off. You know how Todd Howard likes to do these big presentations. He could have been like, let's pick a random planet out of the 1,000. And then he clicks the button and then he goes to that planet and he just shows how awesome it is. And he's like, but we could have gone to this planet. And then he shows that one and it's amazing. They could have showcased that thing that separates it, but they didn't. And maybe it's a master plan to reveal it closer to
I was
launch.
going to ask, do you think they need to show more? Like, is that what you're looking for?
I think show more, specifically, like you said, of the things that make this game special, because it's a problem I've had with Gotham Knights, with all of these other games that people are looking forward to. There's always something that a game kind of specializes in that sets it apart. And the advertising campaigns need to focus on those differentiating factors instead of the generic crap that every other game does. So Gotham Knights, yeah, the combat looks really bland and kind of mediocre, but what isn't bland and mediocre is the crazy rebuilding of Gotham that they did, creating a whole new 400-year timeline to explain the Court of Owls. Like, they've done some incredible work on that game, but nobody knows that because all of the advertising's been about stuff that nobody really cares that much about, that doesn't separate the game. And with Starfield, I feel like they showed off gunplay, which has never been the reason you play BGS games.
Yes,
They showed off
very true.
like, yeah, they showed off some cool sequences that are supposed to highlight the graphics, but again, graphics have never been the reason people play BGS games. It just feels like they're showing the wrong stuff, the stuff that nobody
Okay.
is going to be sold on. instead of focusing on the stuff that actually could sell people. And I don't know if that's a marketing issue, if it's just an issue with communication between the dev team and the marketing people. I don't know, but it is strange that they haven't shown off the things that would make this game stand out.
Yeah, one of the things that's really stood out in the conversation has been, and you touched on it a bit, the 1,000 planets. This has been a highly debated part of the game. That's where the No Man's Sky comparisons came in, and I think it's just important in this conversation to hear, what you feel about seeing that Bethesda's going, quantity, maybe not quality. And I personally sit in your camp of concern with the game when it comes to this feature, because I believe you're going to have a lot of players underwhelmed off the get-go, because just alone based off Todd Howard's statements to the press, he's like, yeah, there's going to be some planets he called that are just an ice ball. And I'm like, okay, so immediately there are going to be places I look at and go, oh, that looks cool, but I'm probably not going to check it out because there's likely nothing there. And I feel like that repeated feeling over and over can become a really bad thing for the gamer. So for you, I want to know where you stand on hearing like there'll be 1,000+ planets to explore, because some see it as good news. Like, I just want to explore and see what this universe holds for me and build things. But many think it's a very scary prospect for the game.
Yeah. What it reminds me of, it's been a while since I watched it, but there are those documentaries, of like the making of Oblivion, the making of Fallout 3 that they used to do all the time. And there was one, I don't remember if it was for Oblivion or if it was for Fallout 3, but I remember specifically it was Todd Howard speaking to the camera. And he said, oh, I tell the team all of the time, we can do anything, we just can't do everything. So this whole process of game development is about picking your battles. And when I hear 1,000 planets, that to me sounds much more like we're doing everything. Even though we probably can't actually manage it. So knowing Todd Howard, like, he isn't a different person. He's not a different game designer than he was back 10, 15 years ago. He still lives by those rules. So there's something he's seeing where his specific approach to creating 1,000 planets is limited in scope enough where it serves the purpose, because everybody talks about 1,000 planets, but nobody talks about like, okay, well, why would you put that into the game? Why do you need 1,000 planets? The reason you do that is to serve a very specific purpose, likely because, like, let's be real, it sounds good in marketing, 1,000 planets, but also because you can have, like you mentioned, tons of variability in resource collection, where you go to different planets to collect specialized resources. You could have different enemies that are specific to planets, which hard gate for end game stuff. There's all sorts of reasons you do it. And if he's doing it for those specific reasons, then cool. Our only concern is that they're just going for 1,000 planets without valid justification, or without let's say gameplay systems that justify those planets existing, because any developer can create like 1,000 blank spheres for you to just walk around on. That's not hard. But creating something that ties in with the gameplay systems to justify your exploration of those planets is something that is another matter. And it's, again, something they could have demonstrated in these demonstrations that they've done of the game so far, but for whatever reason they haven't. And maybe it's because they're buggy, maybe it's because they're not working quite right yet, which is concerning in and of itself. But whatever the reason is, it seems like something that is a huge oversight when it comes to showing off this game, because it's such a huge part of it, but we haven't really seen much of anything about it.
Right. One thing we did see a decent amount about that we could dive, I'd say, a little deeper into is the RPG systems. This is something that Bethesda's been widely criticized for, is as their games have progressively become bigger, not just in scope, but popularity, is they've left behind a lot of their role-playing roots. And, they've never been of the hardcore ilk. Maybe you could say Morrowind was in that basket, but otherwise, I think starting with Oblivion and onwards, they had a more accessible approach, but still letting you kind of tailor things to your own personal playthrough, like the karma system in Fallout 3. It was linear in its moral approach, but it was simplistic enough, but also deep enough where you could, toy around with different builds and different playthroughs. Fallout, sorry, I wish. But Starfield looks to be playing around with more RPG systems where they're saying, no voice protagonist. They're talking about progression through doing things. They're talking about skill checks, backgrounds. We saw a little bit of those on display, how characters would react to you. Did you find any of that encouraging? Because we did start this conversation with like Fallout 4 kind of under-delivering, obviously 76 missing the mark. This feels like sort of a back to basics in some instances. So I want to know if you found that particular part encouraging, along with, if you want to cover it in the same breath, how you felt about the facial animations, which are vastly different from what we saw in previous BGS games.
I mean, I think the one thing to remember is that like every year there are new games coming out, right? But for big studios like BGS, or I guess big and small studios like BGS, they're putting out one game every 5 to 6 years. So they had Skyrim, which most people really loved the leveling system. They thought it was one of the greatest sandbox games of all time where you can just screw around, do whatever you want. And then they experimented with Fallout 4, which didn't connect with as many people, but it was a different thing, still good, but different in a lot of ways. And then Fallout 76, which, as far as I'm concerned, if I'm being completely honest, that seemed to be a cash grab that was put out, probably came down on high from like Robert Altman and the board to try and maximize revenues to be as appealing as possible for a buyout. Which
you were on the money. I want to shout you out for that. You were on the money with that prediction.
Yeah, no, it just made sense, and so I don't put a ton of weight into Fallout 76 as far as like it being reflective of BGS's vision for what a solid BGS game is. I think it's indicative of a lack of like managerial integrity, but that's a separate matter. But that being said, Skyrim had a lot of cool systems. They expanded with something else in Fallout 4. And if we just kind of ignore 76 to a certain extent, this game just represents a return to what they realized their fans enjoyed more, which was like just in their eyes 2 major releases ago, which isn't that big of a deal. Like for them, we tried with Fallout 4 doing something a little different. People didn't love it. We'll just go back to what we did with Skyrim. Cool. We'll do that. Players like that more. That's great. That's tremendous. That's listening to player feedback. It's understanding your audience and trying stuff out, seeing if it works. It doesn't. Okay, we'll go back. No voice protagonist this time. It didn't work. We thought it was cool, but it just didn't work out. That's really uplifting, and that, to me, to their credit, I think is a sign that's very positive. It's indicative of them listening to feedback and trying to make changes to result in the best game possible based on what the feedback is. And so that's one of those things that makes me climb higher on that ladder to be more optimistic of Starfield, because it shows that they're taking an approach that's much more in line with like Skyrim than it was to Fallout 4 or Fallout 76. So I think that's positive. And as for the facial animations and those types of things, they've definitely been doing a lot of work on the tech side to get things working in a different way, or an improved way at least. And that's good to see. But even so, I think the graphics and the animation systems that we saw are just not up to par to the competition, even from 2-3 years ago. And whenever somebody throws out what is, in my opinion, just an excuse, such as, well, it's got 100,000 lines of dialogue, it's going to be huge, it's going to be a massive game. All that is a deflection, and in some ways an admittance of the problem. We're not saying that the game's going to be awful because the graphics are a little outdated. We're just saying the graphics are outdated. Like we're expressing something we observe. It's not that dramatic. And to deflect it, I think, doesn't hold Bethesda's feet to the fire in a way that's helpful. Like I think they need creative pressures to get better and to make improvements. Otherwise, they'll just keep doing the bare minimum, because they've been able to do that for years and years, like we've seen with these latest revelations with regards to, modders already working on bug fixes, and the game hasn't even come out yet. Crazy stuff like that.
Absolutely. Bethesda Game Studios kind of reminds me of Game Freak in a similar way, where Game Freak was such a special team for generations for people, because they were making these excellent Pokemon game that everyone loved. But as everyone got older, they wanted more, but the team size and scope vision all remained the same and didn't age properly with the industry, where you got things like Sword and Shield, which felt very much like a 3DS game brought to the Switch, and it under-delivered. And I think the same thing with BGS, where, this is a small team that used to do the impossible, right? They used to have 100 people on a team and deliver worlds that were bigger and prettier than what 1,000+ man teams were doing. And it was fascinating to watch them work. But as the industry's become more complex, more expensive to work within, they've tried to scale up, and to their credit, they have, right? They've invested in new teams, opened new studios. We're still talking about, in the scope of AAA development, that they're a relatively small team. And I think those days of Bethesda magic are gone. Another comparison, probably a more understandable one for many, is BioWare, where they often marketed BioWare magic as a big thing in their studio because they were in a similar position, like small teams just somehow finding a way to put out these consistent Game of the Year winners for an entire 2 generations, between Mass Effect, Dragon Age, KOTOR, Jade Empire. They just seemingly never missed. And I think what's happening is that these teams are trying to apply, and you kind of hinted at it earlier with what Todd said in a documentary, these old practices with new age game development. And it just doesn't iron out well, where you get something like Starfield, which I think environmentally looks great. But yeah, when you get close up, compared to their past work, it is an improvement. If you look at it through that avenue, it's like, okay, it does look good. But compared to the rest of the industry, it doesn't stand up to the task as well.
I think it is interesting because you go back, like I watched that Making of Obsidian documentary, and in it they take the game to E3 and they show the audience, I think it was E3 like 2006 or 7, it was sometime in like the mid 2000s that they showed it off at first, and the audiences at E3 are like, man, Obsidian, or not Obsidian, Oblivion, they look at it and they're like, man, the forests in Oblivion look amazing, and this is the best looking forest and game of the show. It's graphically amazing, and it does look very good, especially for a game that came out around then. But the idea that a BGS game would come out and be like the graphic showcase of all of E3, that is like unfathomable nowadays. I mean, you see what some other studios like Rockstar are able to do, or what Naughty Dog's able to pull off, Sony Santa Monica. They're able to do amazing things graphically, and BGS just can't quite keep up. And I think in large part it's because the tool set that they're using is in some ways a relic of the past, and it's not easy to have an engine that you develop in-house that keeps up with what some of the big guys are doing. Let's be real. I mean, even CD Projekt Red walked away from their Red engine that they used to create The Witcher 3 and Cyberpunk. That's a huge deal, but it just goes to show you, they looked at it and they're like, you know what? It just doesn't make sense to have a team of hundreds of programmers working on the engine when we could just let another company like Epic, develop Unreal Engine, and we'll just use that and let them handle the tech upgrades and stuff. So I think as long as Bethesda focuses on using in many ways outdated tools, they're going to be limited and held back in terms of the max potentiality of their games. And we'll see. I mean, who knows? Maybe they'll come out and they'll blow everybody away, and they'll reveal like a brand new engine that they've been making for the last 5 years, and it'll be...
Well, they do have Creation Engine too, so there is that. But depends how you look at it, right? It's really an updated thing of what they currently have. It's an overhaul in a lot of ways. I don't know if it would qualify as brand new. It's funny because like I always define it, I think I said in your video, like I define it as like the Bethesda stink, and when the Starfield screenshots leaked,
I love that, by the way.
Yeah.
I've used that ever since. So
by all means, steal it. Yeah, because I just like, when I remember the screenshots leaked for Starfield back in 2020, I was like, you could just still tell. Like you can just, and I like that about certain games, and Bethesda game studios especially. Like I love that I can tell it's their games, but I think from the wider perspective, does it having that odor technically aid them? And it's a catch-22, right? Because at the same time, this engine is so highly customizable and moddable, and that latter part is what's really important to Bethesda, because they know what brings in people for selling these games for a decade plus. I think a lot of people love Skyrim, but I think a lot of people love modding Skyrim more. Same thing with Fallout, and so having that capability there, Bethesda knows that's just sometimes selling the game twice to the same person. Like, oh, you bought it on console, and in the next 5 years you got a PC, and you ended up buying Starfield again, so you can go ahead and mod that. Maybe it'll be a different story now with Game Pass being a factor and them kind of unlocking the doors to modding, but that's the issue with the engine discussion for Bethesda, I feel, is, you have a situation where it's like they are using something that feels like it's a bit behind on the industry, but then you look at their modding capabilities and they're like number one. And it's almost their Achilles heel because people always say, I mean, we just talked about the community patch being developed by people ahead of the game's launch. They're already looking at it going like, okay, this is probably going to be buggy. And that's a little bit humiliating for Bethesda. So it sort of leads to distrust within their community. So it's a very fascinating conversation to have on the tech side with them because it's really hard to satisfy everyone for sure.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, I think this is why taking a skeptical approach and holding studios' feet to the fire, regardless of whether it's BGS or CD Projekt Red or whoever, it's because there's a sort of natural selection that goes on at these studios based on selection pressures, not to just like completely go into the realm of like biological evolution, but the same process that works in nature to force selective pressures to cause certain traits to evolve is the same thing that goes on at studios. Like if they aren't receiving pressure to massively improve graphics or to change how they made this gameplay system or to do this or to do that, they're just not going to, because there's only so many hours in the day. There's only so much money to go around in the budget. They're going to focus on what the fans really want to see and what is going to improve sales and revenue, blah, blah, blah. And so long as the community of BGS followers tolerates buggy releases, makes it very clear that they will not just tolerate, but that they will take steps to actually help Bethesda, like patch the game on launch day. Like Bethesda's managers are just going to look at it and be like, okay, well, I mean, they're going to help us with it and they're going to patch it. So like, even if the PC port is a little rough, it'll be okay, because BGS fans have a very high tolerance for bugs. And so they don't need to fix it. You know, they're good. They're good. Just like, you know, if you've got a Jeep and it's really bumpy on the road because this model has like the shocks are just shot and are terrible. If Jeep drivers happen to like bumpy rides, then they're like, oh, well, we won't fix it because the audience and the customers don't care. So we just won't fix it. It's the same thing that goes on here. So it worries me. Like, it's funny, but it worries me when I see that the audience and the customers are already sort of excusing Bethesda's lack of polish and refinement, because in some ways they're used to it. And also just because, like you said, the modding community is huge with these games. It's something they like. It's almost like an added bonus to buying the game is that they get to tinker with it and have fun with it. But I think for the broader customer base, the people that don't mod the crap out of these games, at least for the first playthrough or two, it's sort of a bad sign, because it allows Bethesda to get away with doing stuff that any other studio doing would get them raked across the coals for.
Absolutely. And that's totally fair. There is definitely a different treatment of Bethesda game studios compared to the rest of the industry. And it'll be interesting as we, really approach the launch of this game, how the conversation develops, because I remember when it was first revealed last year, it was, relatively middle of the road. Like, that was it. Then this year, it seems like, granted, I'm in the tighter BGS Xbox circle, so I see a lot more positivity. So that's why I wanted to bring you on, to get that more skeptical, that more critical point of view there from someone who's not really deeply entrenched in that community. Bring your thoughts, kind of freshen things up a little bit. But as we approach that launch, Bethesda has to market things completely differently. We talked about that. We have to see those deeper looks at, I think, the leveling system, the exploration, the gunplay, all that scales with the game. What makes it unique, the dialogue, the skill checks, all that stuff. We have to see how all of that goes. And they have, I'd imagine, another, 8 months to get all that done if they're going to release at the latest point possible. So, it's going to be a really interesting road to them to release, and it's going to be very different. Normally, we're used to Bethesda Game Studios announce, see you in 5 months. That's when the game's out. That's been the last two major releases from them. Now they're playing by actually the old Ubisoft rulebook. Like, they announced it way in advance back in, 2018. Then they show it off in 2020. They put a date on it. They delay it a major amount, show off gameplay. A really kind of crazy bumpy road for it. Again, though, speaking of what you said earlier, most people, if it were any other company, would be like, I don't know about that. That's a really up and down roller coaster ride. But it's Bethesda Game Studios. There is a little bit of, I'd say favoritism, believe it or not, to them in the industry, a little more willingness to understand them. So I think your thoughts are completely valid. And I just wanted to invite you on here to talk about it more. But is there anything else you'd like to throw out there as we wrap this conversation up?
Yeah, I would just say that I'm still very interested in the game, you know, and people that share my thought process. We can still look forward to the game, and when it releases, many of us will play it, and I'm sure many of us will have a good time with it. But when it comes to hyping it up, when it comes to making excuses for things that are lackluster, I would just say to like the fanboys and girls out there, I don't think that actually helps anything. You know, to see graphics that aren't on par with the competition, you can acknowledge that and still be excited for the game. You don't have to be like, you know, deflecting and making
Like one
excuses
side
for
or
it.
the other. Yeah.
Yeah, like it's okay to have a more nuanced position than this is the greatest thing ever and this is total ass. Like it's okay to be somewhere in the middle of that. And that's just what I would ask people to think of, whether they watch somebody else's views and they recognize that they're a little more nuanced, or, you know, even to try and take on more nuanced views yourself, and to be able to hold Bethesda's feet to the fire when they need it and hype them up when they deserve it. But
Absolutely.
all that said, I mean, I'm interested. We'll see what the next 6-7 months looks like. I'm willing to be sold. I want to be sold. I want to be
100%.
hyped. And they definitely have the potential to do that if they keep showing it off. So we'll
Right
see
on.
it. I'm sure I'll be watching your videos, Matty, to find out more. So I'll be watching.
Right on. Fret not. We will talk about this again. It's been a pleasure chatting with you more, Luke, because I know you and I go way back. So it's been fun collaborating with you. And for those who are unfamiliar with you and our past work together, you know, where can everyone find you? I'll have it all linked down below.
Yeah. I am a YouTuber. I also have started streaming recently, and that's been going really well. Just my name, Luke Stevens, with a PH, STEPHENS. But check that out. I'm on YouTube. I do big critiques of games, you know, the big 3, 4, 5 hour critiques of games. And then we've also been doing video essays. And like I said, over on Twitch, we've been playing and streaming a lot. So come over there, say hi, hang out, let me know that Matty sent you. I'll appreciate
please.
that. Yeah, that'd be super cool.
Awesome. So that'll all be linked down in the description below. Please check out Luke's stuff. He's a great content creator. I love his stuff. There's a reason why I brought him on here. So again, please do check it out. Luke, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you lending me not only that, but your thoughts. I think they're very interesting and as you used, very nuanced compared to the rest of the conversation. So I appreciate you. And with that, thank you all so much for tuning in to a more podcast format style video. Who would you like me to chat with next about whatever? I'll take all suggestions in the comments down below. With that, take great care of yourself, and I will see you in the next video. Stay sexy, stay active. I love you all. Peace.
Oh, I saw it live. I saw the sign off live. Wow.